So get ready for tens of billions of dollars in new spending to be foreshadowed in the speech from the throne. More money for healthcare and pandemic economic supports, more money for rebuilding the economy. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is already warning that the current levels of spending, deficit and debt, well, they're not sustainable. Why not? And what should the federal government do instead? Let's find out. Yves Giroux is Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer, and he joins me now. Mr. Giroux, good to see you again. It's good of you to take some time to speak with me today. Thanks for doing it.
A pleasure.
Now, we know the current deficit is probably nudging about $400 billion, and the federal accumulated debt's around $1 trillion. And the speech from the throne, well, we think it's going to promise even more spending. What is your concern here?
The concern here is about the level of debt that we are accumulating, and also about the potential for the level of deficit that we are seeing this year, the potential for this deficit to be sustained over the next couple or several years. So that's a concern, as well as the absence of any plan, at least as of yet, on the government's part as to what it plans on doing to restore the deficit to more sustainable levels. So we haven't seen any signals on that point from the government yet. There's a new Minister of Finance, so she needs to be briefed on various issues. So I'm hoping that in the next couple of days, if not weeks, we will have a plan from the government as to what it plans on doing with fiscal anchors, with the deficit going forward beyond 2021.
We like to drill down here, so let's drill down a little bit. What makes a deficit unsustainable?
Well, what makes a deficit unsustainable is first its level, as well as how often, over how many years are we incurring increasing levels of deficit. And that is worrisome because it can lead to structural deficits, which in turn can lead to ever-increasing debt to GDP ratios. Right now we have, or before the pandemic, I should say, we were at debt to GDP ratios of about 31%. With the deficit that we expect this year, this ratio will go above 45%, and that's not in and of itself of big concern. However, it would be of big concern if the deficit was to be of the same magnitude year after year for several years, pushing the debt to deficit ratio on an upward trend, which would be very difficult to bring back to a more sustainable level. And if we have a deficit of 15-16% of GDP for several years, it's then very difficult to bring that down to 0 or even 2 or 3% as a percent of GDP.
Let me follow up on that. So so let's say we have these sustained deficits in I suppose the $400 billion a year range for the next couple of years, maybe more. What are the consequences of that? What starts to happen?
Well, what starts to happen is a couple of things. First, we have rating agencies that start to be concerned about the level of debt, especially if other countries are faring much better than us. So that's one thing, and that could lead to increasing costs of borrowing for the government itself, the federal government, as well as provinces and territories, but also for corporations and private citizens. That doesn't seem to be a big concern for most people right now, rightly so, because the cost of borrowing is at historic lows. But one thing we know looking back at history is that interest rates have not always been that low. And if interest rates start to rise and we have a huge debt or a much bigger debt than we used to, then the cost of servicing that debt will, of course, also increase, which is quite possible over the next 5 or 10 years. And when the cost of servicing that debt increases, it means that it's money that we don't have available to allocate to other policy priorities, and think about any area of government spending, or to reduce taxes. So debt in and of itself, if it was financed at 0%, would not be a concern. But because we have to pay interest on that debt, that's why it's a concern.
I mean, so much of this is about, you don't look at necessarily countries in isolation. It's a competitive world. The government points to Canada's strong economic position. You've touched on it. Heading into the pandemic relative to other G7 countries. They're all spending their way through the pandemic as well. So if all our competitors are racking up big deficits and debt, why is it important for Canada to cut back?
Well, I'm not saying it's necessary for Canada to cut back. What is necessary is to have a plan going ahead. And a plan might be restoring fiscal balance over a number of years, or it can be reducing the deficit to reach 2% of GDP or whatever the target is. But right now, there is no plan going forward. And that's what's worrying. Of course, the level of debt or deficit that we're seeing right now is not in and of itself that concerning because it was seen by most stakeholders, most commentators as necessary, and the majority of our counterparts, other countries, have done something that's similar with various degrees in terms of the magnitude of the spending. But most countries have undertaken some vigorous
Right.
fiscal action. So the current level of deficit is very high, of course, but it's not worrying as long as it's not repeated year after year.
One of the ideas being floated is big tax hikes on companies and individuals, high wealth Canadians that have been able to get through the pandemic, perhaps better than others, as a way to try and rein in the spending over time. Is that the way to go, or does that have consequences too?
Um, that's a policy choice. So the government could decide to increase taxes on certain sectors, certain types of individuals or corporations. That being said, taxing always has consequences. If people or corporations are taxed at a higher rate, they'll try to minimize their tax take, legally speaking, by rearranging their businesses in a way that minimizes the amount of taxes they pay. So and that's what we call the behavioral impact. So when you increase a tax rate on highly mobile factors such as corporations, there are some leakages, and because you have a tax base of a certain size doesn't mean by that increasing taxes that will automatically lead to an increase that's commensurate with your tax base and the tax increase because of that behavioral change. So it has consequences, but it doesn't mean that it's unsurmountable consequences. So things can be done, but again, it's a policy choice
Right.
whether the government wants to reduce the deficit by reducing its current level of spending or taxing more.
Yves Giroux is Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer. Always good to get your perspective, and thanks for providing it to us again today. Take care.
Pleasure. You too.